and then hit broadcast. Hi, everyone, and thank you for taking a work break with us and joining today's webinar. We're going to give everyone just a few moments to log in and get settled. While we do that, as you come in, please set the chat panel to make sure you're sharing with all attendees and panelists, and let us know where you're joining from today, which cities, which countries. We'd love to hear from you. As people log in, I just want to let you know that we will be listening to Professor Michael Sugrue's Reflections on Meditations, the private writings of Marcus Aurelius, who is the last of the 5 good emperors. A little background on Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic philosopher and a Roman emperor. He was a conscientiously moral man who sought to avoid the temptations of absolute power, which he treated as absolute responsibility, something that Dr. Sugrue will be going into further. His seriousness, self-discipline, and courage are beautifully put in his observations. Even in a palace, it is possible to live well. Once again, as people join, feel free to set your chat to all attendees and panelists and let us know where you're joining from today. We'd love to hear from you. And we are looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion about meditations, and would love to hear all of the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. So today, I do have the great pleasure of welcoming Dr. Michael Sugrue to our new webinar series, Classics Revisited. He is a professor at Ave Maria University, a graduate of the Great Books program. He earned his BA in history from the University of Chicago and his MA, Masters of Philosophy, and PhD in history from Columbia University. Prior to taking his position at Ave Maria University, Professor Sugrue taught at Princeton University, Columbia University, Johns Hopkins University, and many others. My name is Christy Goebel. I'm a global marketing specialist here at Bibliotheca. And behind the scenes, we have my colleague Kelly Knutson helping to make sure everything runs smoothly. We will be sharing the chat log with all attendees, so make sure you switch those settings over to the all attendees and panelists, excuse me. If you have specific questions, please use the Q&A panel. The like button helps float the most popular questions that you want Professor Sugrue to answer to the top. So please use that feature if you see a similar question or something you're interested in. Once again, we're looking at today's webinar as a give and take discussion about the classic meditations, and would love to hear all of the questions that Dr. Sugrue's lecture may inspire. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Michael. We've pre-recorded his reflections, his lecture in advance, but Dr. Sugrue will join us at the end to take questions live. So sit back, relax, enjoy this great lecture. I've listened to it for like 4 times or more, and it is an amazing discussion on meditations. Enjoy.
The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is a unique piece of work. It's a standard piece of Stoic philosophy. It's also a kind of memoir of a very powerful, very moral man. And Marcus Aurelius was the last of the 5 good emperors. He ruled Rome from 161 to 180, and he was an exceptionally moral, exceptionally serious man who worked every day to do his best for the public good. So Stoicism is a philosophy of social and political obligation, and the Stoic philosopher makes the best of whatever situation he's born into in life. Remember that social mobility was very, very limited in the ancient world. I mean, it occasionally happened, but it was most unusual. Instead, you were born a farmer, or you were born a slave, or you were born a landowner, or you were born a townsman or a craftsman, or you were born an emperor. And the Stoic philosophy holds that the good man does his duty to the people around him. And his primary concern is meeting his obligations, regardless of whether these obligations are pleasant or painful. So the Stoic philosopher is trying to be above pleasure and pain. He's trying to organize his fear so he doesn't fear pain as much as he fears bad action. And the Stoicism may be thought of as a kind of philosophy of resignation. You can't control the world. Right? We're not God. But we can control ourselves and we can control our conduct. So we can resign ourselves to the fact of the world. We all live so many years and no more, right? Human life is finite. Life has its ups and downs. We can't completely control what fortune sends our way. But we can completely control the way we respond to these things. And our response makes all the difference, right? So if we study self-restraint, self-control, we'll find a way to deal with the pressures and hardships of life, and we won't succumb to the temptation to do less than our best. Right? The Stoic philosopher holds that if any person can achieve moral goodness, then any person should be able to. In other words, every person is capable of doing what one person can do. If one person is capable of controlling himself and of showing himself superior to pleasure and pain, there's no reason why anybody else should not be able to do that. So Stoicism is also a no excuses philosophy. All right. It is applicable not just to the ancient world, but it's applicable to all times when the world is chaotic and unpredictable, when we need to be tough and times are uncertain. So Stoicism is a very apt philosophy for the present as well. Now, Marcus Aurelius didn't write this book with the intention of being published. He wrote it in Greek to himself. Every evening after his day was over, before retiring, he would write little notes to himself. So the book doesn't have an overall coherence. It's a whole collection of scraps, a little bit like Pascal's Pensées, if you know what the structure of that or the lack of structure of that looks like. There are certain themes that recur again and again. And what we have here is Marcus Aurelius talking to himself. And Marcus Aurelius is talking to himself because he's in a way too powerful for friends. There's a certain point in political power where everybody wants something from you, where everybody has an ulterior motive. It's hard to believe that while in office, a president of the United States can have friends. Everybody wants something from a person that's that powerful. I don't see how it's possible to avoid it. And the result for Aurelius was that he ruled in a very strict, somber way, for about 19 years. And he never made a disgrace of himself, which almost all the Roman emperors did. And he shows us the very rare case of unchecked libido not turning out to be a moral nightmare. Roman emperors were absolute rulers of all they surveyed. They controlled everything from Egypt to England. They could do anything they wished, pretty much, or de facto. And Marcus Aurelius, instead of luxuriating and dissipating himself, he was a very able administrator, not particularly great at expanding the empire, but dutiful, careful, and he went out to the borderlands near the Danube to be with his troops. He once wrote to himself in his notes, "Even in the palace it is possible to live well." So, since Marcus Aurelius, like other Roman emperors, had no external or almost no external restraints imposed upon him, either he controls himself or he becomes a frightful hideous creature like Nero or Caligula or any of the really dangerous and depraved emperors. The burden of carrying the absence of coercion is something that will destroy nearly any man. As Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But in the case of Marcus Aurelius, it doesn't seem to have done that. Instead, what we see when we take away the restraint of law and custom is that this is a very good man who is able to control himself for an extended period of time, under conditions in which most people would be living a riotous, disgraceful life within a month. Ask yourself how long you could deal with not having any restraint on your feelings or desires or emotions. Absolute libido is a very dangerous thing, and very few people have the strength to keep that in check. Marcus Aurelius did, and it's to his great credit. Marcus Aurelius means Marcus the Golden, and it's not surprising that that was how he was known, because he's as close as the world has ever come to a Platonic philosopher king. He works diligently. He tries to develop and maintain virtues. He is deeply committed to doing the right thing every day. And it is clear that the weight of the burden, because he views being an emperor as a burden, the weight of it is crushing him. There's a deep melancholy in Aurelius. I mean, he's, in a way, the loneliest man in the world. Everyone is beneath him. Most of them are thieves and incompetents and liars and various kinds of fool. And he has to deal with that day in, day out for 19 years. There's no vacation time for an emperor unless he wants to go on vacation, and Marcus doesn't. He goes to the frontier so he can be with his troops. He's an extraordinary example of a certain kind of ruthless introspection and morally serious self-examination. In some ways, he's a saint of reason. In other ways, he seems like a sort of Calvinist without Christianity, a bit of a Puritan in Babylon. How such a man emerges, I don't know. It's one of those flukes of history, one of those freaks of nature. And I don't know how to account for the fact that anybody should emerge like this as a Roman emperor. It is a surprising thing to see in human nature. Now, some of his statements are very wise and very sharp. And myself, I've been reading this book since I was 14. So next year, it'll be 50 years that I've been reading this book. And it has all kinds of wise maxims in it. And there is much to be learned from Marcus. He says, look, either teach people or put up with people. We are social animals, and those are our choices. And he's right. You can't wash your hands of people. So either teach them to be better than they are, or accept them as they are. And he's got a good point there. You can't perfect people. You can't perfect society, but you can improve it. And to the extent that you can, that's your obligation. Also, there's a sense that human life is evanescent. It's frail and uncertain. He says in one of his beautiful, very sharp passages, soon you will have forgotten all things, and soon all things will have forgotten you. In other words, it's hard to get too terribly excited about anything if you keep in mind that soon you will have forgotten all things and all things will have forgotten you. It's a great antidote to the hubris and the arrogance that would almost inevitably come from being a Roman emperor. Marcus is constantly telling him to restrain pride and arrogance, not to lose his temper. to do the best he can every day. And he's a man of extraordinary virtue. And he is, in a way, the definition of a self-starter, the definition of a self-regulator. He's perhaps one of the few men in history. The only other one I could possibly think of is Ashoka in India. But he's one of the few men in history that actually didn't crumble under the weight of absolute power. Instead, he ground out his life, gritting his teeth, reminding himself that stoic self-control and doing the right thing every moment of every day is the best kind of human life. And the problem is he's saying this while he's gritting his teeth. He spends an awful lot of time reminding himself how great his life is, I think because he is so weary of the job he's been doing. He will not get relieved of his post, as he puts it, until he dies. The God or the gods have put him here, and he says, look, I don't know if gods or the God exists, or God or the gods exist. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. If they don't, well, then I have nothing to lose by doing my duty because it's just atoms moving around. On the other hand, if they do, then I'm going to trust that God put me here for a reason, and that's my job to do the right thing, and that God doesn't want to hear excuses any more than I do. And you got to kind of like the guy because he doesn't just expect this from other people, he expects this from himself. He actually doesn't expect the people around him to meet these high standards because, well, he's used to the fact that people are foolish and vicious and dishonest. Every time a governor comes in to give an accounting of his, tenure as governor, everybody in the room, including Aurelius, knows that he's being lied to because all kinds of financial skullduggery goes on. There's no double entry bookkeeping going on here. So he knows that there's plenty of thievery and dishonesty and plotting. And Aurelius is a sort of lighthouse in the dark. Everybody respected him because when someone actually lives a virtuous life and is what they appear to be, honest virtue makes its own friends. So Marcus Aurelius is a kind of icon of the righteous ruler. He is as happy as people can be on the basis of pure reason. In other words, what's characteristic of all of ancient philosophy, both Greek and Roman, is that among all the schools, all the Roman and Greek philosophers are agreed that in order to be happy, one needs to be reasonable. And that reason is what's missing from human life. And if we could only be reasonable, we could all be good Epicureans or good Stoics or good skeptics or whatever you want to be. This is the end of the line for that set of assumptions. The reason why Hegel, for example, calls Marcus Aurelius the unhappy consciousness is because he's as reasonable as people are going to get. And the problem is, although he constantly is saying, boy, I'm really happy. I'm so happy that I'm living according to nature and rationality. You can't help but get the impression that he is so weary and can't wait for the freedom that comes with death. So Marcus Aurelius leaves us with a question. Granted that he's one of the greatest men that ever lived, kind of standard for the connection between politics and ethics. The further question, which will get answered another couple of centuries later, is this: is reason enough for a satisfactory human life? I guess that would mean that something like the old Dr. Spock from Star Trek would be a perfect human being. Or is reason not enough? And if reason isn't enough, then something needs to be added to ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. And what that thing might be, we'll have to see at a later point. For now, Marcus Aurelius should be everyone's friend. I've read it at big junctures in my life when I was undergoing chemotherapy, when I was sitting for my oral qualifying exams for the PhD. Whenever I get nervous, I go to Marcus, and I hope he becomes your friend as well as mine. Marcus Aurelius is a psychologically complex figure because he wrote a book to himself, and it looks like he's carrying on a conversation with himself. And this, in some ways, is what the Stoic philosopher does. He's constantly examining his conscience and examining his consciousness, and he's looking for the things that slip by. He's always looking for weakness and for excuse making. One of the great things about Stoic philosophy is that there aren't any excuses. If you decide that you are going to behave honorably and rationally, you will not do harm to yourself or to anyone else. And that means that you will protect the people who are under you. And if you are below someone else, you will be a good subordinate. Whatever position in life you're given, you're supposed to take that position and do well. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor, and he's one of the great Roman Stoics, but another great Roman Stoic, Epictetus, was a slave. So it doesn't matter where you are in society, at the top or the bottom. It doesn't matter where you are, whether you're at the North or the South Pole or at the equator. It doesn't matter whether you're in China or in Rome. It doesn't matter whether you're in where you're living 1000 BC or 1000 AD. The point is that wherever you are, as Marcus says, the best time to begin living philosophically is now. So he says, look, you deserve to be unhappy because you've decided to be good tomorrow, not today. And isn't that the problem that we all have? Everybody wants to be good, but they don't want to be good today. But they think tomorrow would be a good time to practice virtue. For now, they like to do bad stuff. So Marcus Aurelius is a kind of reminder of what human beings are capable of, and his stoicism and his principled absolutism about right and wrong is going to eventually become the most important element in Kantian philosophy. So Kantian philosophy can be thought of as a kind of revved up Enlightenment version of Stoicism. And Kant's categorical imperative is the kind of thing that I think would be endorsed by the Stoics because it's a universal moral law. The Stoic wise man is described as being cosmopolitan, and cosmopolitan in the original sense means that the cosmos is his polis. He's a man who's at home everywhere. He's a universal man. There's a universal moral code accessible through reason. In other words, you can know you ought not to murder your brother just by investigating the natural moral structure of reality. Reason discloses that. And that means that the rational Stoic wise man can live according to nature, which is to live according to reason. And in so doing, life is the same everywhere. Now, one final irony, this I've always thought was funny about Marcus Aurelius. He had real problems. I mean, most of us succumb to self-pity early on, right? You know, when you have a problem with your boss or a problem with a friend or a problem with a family member. Marcus Aurelius had real problems. For example, civil war, when dangerous generals decided to set themselves up as an alternative to Marcus. Or plague, which hit the Mediterranean and caused a mass die-off. Or barbarians coming across the Danube. In other words, those are problems which make our ordinary problems shrink to insignificance. So in some ways, Marcus is great at reminding us not to succumb to self-pity. On the other hand, one of the funny things about Stoicism is that he works very hard to protect us from plagues and famines, and civil wars and earthquakes and floods and all that stuff. But it's a funny irony that if everyone underneath Marcus were equally stoic, they wouldn't regard earthquakes and floods and civil wars and famines as being all that big a deal, because Stoics don't get excited about that. So when a Stoic protects people from, say, a flood or an earthquake, or helps them out, he's protecting them and their hurts, although he himself doesn't see the point in getting hurt about stuff like that. So he's helping out people that aren't as wise or as rational as him. And that perhaps is the Achilles heel of Stoicism. There's a great deal of hubris or pride in it. The idea that you can perfect yourself. It's what Christians call Pelagianism, right? And Stoicism is a noble philosophy, but it's also a good philosophy for people who think they're better than other people. And that's what Stoics have to watch out for.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to actually invite Michael now to join us by turning his camera and his mic back on. Hello, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that great lecture. We recorded that about a week ago, I want to say, and I do have to let our audience know as to how impressed I am. I've had a lot of professors, and I know that you've been lecturing on meditations for quite a few years based on our conversations, but that was done with very few notes and in pretty much one go. I have to say I was very impressed as to how you could just go about Marcus Aurelius and all the history and all of the Stoic philosophy that he is known for. Is there anything else you want to add before we go into the questions from the audience?
He's a friend of mine. I don't use
No, that's great. So thank you for those who wrote in questions. I'm going to go over to the Q&A panel right now and ask those questions to Michael. Please keep adding thoughts and questions as they come up. We know how these lectures and discussions go. You hear one question, another one comes up in your head that you want clarity on. I also may have a couple of questions, but we're definitely going to focus on the audience questions first, because I feel guilty because I get the professor on the side occasionally to ask other questions outside of the webinar time period. So this came in, are there particular translations of the meditations you recommend to someone reading them for the first time?
Well, I don't think it matters all that much, right? I happen to have a sentimental attachment to, I think it's the Bull translation, but I'm not sure about that. But it's the old Classics Club translation that you can get for $1. I beat that book up for a long time. And then my daughter got me another one, which was a great thing to have. But I still read that translation. And I think it's kind of dated, but I've always liked the poetry of it. On the other hand, really, you can't go wrong with whatever copy of Aurelius you get. Sit down, read it, and think about it. You know, it provokes so many questions. One of my friends, who's a psychiatrist, told me that he thinks that the kind of Stoicism that Aurelius advocated was the first version of what he called cognitive behavioral therapy. You have a problem, figure out how to solve it, and then do something. So perhaps it is connected to contemporary psychology. I don't know.
Wonderful. Kind of going off of the translation factor, one of the questions that came in are there contemporary sources that describe Marcus Aurelius from other perspectives? And what did the people around him think of him in his contemporary time?
Okay, that's an interesting question. We need to sort of unlearn the Gladiator movie version of Marcus Aurelius. Richard Harris does a good job of showing a man who's extremely conscientious, tough-minded, but also humane. And that's a hard combination to put together, much less to maintain over a period of years. So we have, I believe, the commentary of some of the Roman historians. I can't call the relevant text to mind right now, but there is adequate evidence that he was regarded as an unusually pious and unusually virtuous individual. First of all, because the Antonines were the best phase in imperial Roman history. He was the last of the 5 good emperors, and he was exactly the kind of conscientious man that Rome needed. So there is information about Aurelius, but not much about his inner psychic self. People were impressed by what they saw. Just the fact that they tagged him Aurelius, the Golden, all right, tells you what you need to know. That didn't come afterward. That was a contemporary title. All right. So, yeah, people thought highly of him. There's a wonderful book by Walter Pater called Marius the Epicurean. And I believe that he mentions, he does a kind of interpretation of Aurelius in that.
Wonderful. So this question came in, Dr. Sugrue, how does Marcus Aurelius's Stoicism compare with the modern ideas of minimalism? And there's kind of some subsets to that. 1, priorities need to be set. 2, trends are temporary. 3, purchases are temporary. Timelessness is the way to go, et cetera, et cetera. So how does it compare with modern ideas of minimalism?
Okay. Minimalism is probably more connected to cynicism, which tries to create an absolute simplicity of life. All right. I would call Aurelius a more civilized version of cynicism, which doesn't ignore or dismiss the genuinely important and worthy achievements of civilization. Cynics like Diogenes live in a barrel, masturbate in public, and are completely shameless. That's why they're called cynics, dogs. The old story of Alexander the Great going to him with a great train and asking Diogenes what he wanted, and Diogenes says, "You're in my light." All right. So he could have had anything, but all he wanted was to get direct access to the sun. He wants nothing from the great emperor. In that cynicism, there's a certain sort of meanness. Not everything is affectation, and not everything is worthless. There's plenty of corruption and vile conduct in the world of, cities and trade and technology and science. But on the other hand, there are compensating virtues. Okay. The cynic doesn't notice that. The Stoic does.
Interesting. I also had a question here for, can you discuss the 4 virtues of Stoicism? Justice, wisdom, temperance, and courage, and how Marcus Aurelius's interpretation of them is similar or different from how we think of them today.
Okay, good question. No doubt Marcus Aurelius would affirm that all of those are admirable virtues and that he pursues them all. But you have to remember, this is not drawn from that set of 4 is not drawn from Marcus Aurelius. It's drawn from Plato's Republic. Right? So wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice are the 4 virtues that we find in the well-organized soul and in the well-organized city. Marcus, of course, in taking up Stoicism, has taken up a fragment of Socratic philosophy, particularly the fragment connected with moral and political duties. This is the best and most practical part of the Socratic tradition, and the best of the Romans made the most of this. Now, how did he take these virtues up? Well, he would be of the opinion that wherever you are at any given point, it's possible to find out how to behave well. Your actions are constrained by external reality. You can only lift so much. You are only going to live for so long. There are physical constraints upon us. But within those physical constraints, we have a certain degree of unconstrained choice. And the point is to always direct your choices towards the obligations you have towards other people. All right. So it's a sense, well, Stoicism is a deep and abiding sense of obligation to others. And it would be an excellent kind of philosophy, for example, to teach at West Point or other military academies. The reason why is that they will be called upon to exercise stoic virtues, to risk their lives and still do their duty. It's a very hard thing to do. And so Stoicism is often associated with Roman military life, and understandably so.
Okay. We had a question that I'm going to go a little bit further, because this was actually leading into one of my questions as well. The question entered was, did Marcus Aurelius believe in God? Continuing with one of the questions that I had for you, is you bring up God and Christianity a number of times in the lecture. Constantine, who brought Christianity to the Roman Empire, essentially, or is at least accredited for that, would be over 100 years after Marcus Aurelius. How do gods play into the Aurelius philosophy or Stoic philosophy? And did a Stoic philosopher, with their pride and goal to perfect themselves, view themselves as above gods?
That's a very complicated question, but it's a very good question. All right. The point that always worries me is that human beings, myself included, are subject to hubris, and we like to flatter ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that means that the Greco-Roman tradition, since they couldn't think of any reason not to believe that things, including people, could be perfected, well, told themselves that in principle, both individuals and societies were perfectible. Now, the Romans, of course, were willing to settle for second best, for what works. But the Greeks were actually interested in various kinds of perfection, both for individuals and for societies. Now, Marcus is clearly in the tradition of that man who is working on the perfection, or if not the perfection, the improvement of his own soul. And yet he never succumbs to the pride or arrogance we might assume would follow along with that. Now, does he believe in the gods? No, I can't tell. There's a deeply religious element to the way he thinks about the world. And if the gods don't, and he's kind of stuck in the place that Pascal left us with the wager, right? He says, well, maybe they exist, maybe they don't. I don't have time to figure it out. I have to deal with the plague. And one of the great things about him, he says, look, I'd like to figure out a whole bunch of stuff and go back to my library and read. But unfortunately, I have to run the world and they won't let me. So there's a sense in which he would really prefer not to be running the Roman Empire. And that is, I guess, the mark that he is one of the few people that deserves that kind of job, because everybody who's avid to get that sort of power is dangerous. One of the points that Socrates made about political philosophy is that no one is fit to govern others until they learn to govern themselves. And that's actually a really deep insight, particularly given some of the political shenanigans we've seen of late. Marcus Aurelius is a great standard for a man who refuses to make moral compromise when it would be very tempting to do so. So I'd be inclined to say that he represents as good as we can get while just using our reason. My guess is we may need something more than reason for life to be satisfactory. Now, what that might be, I'm not sure.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. I have a question here for just what other writings in a similar vein might you recommend to people who are enjoying Aurelius and want to read something similar?
Wow. Okay. You could read the handbook. It's called the Enchiridion of Epictetus. It's a solid piece of Stoicism. It's a little dry. There's also Seneca. His letters are very nice, if what you're asking me is about Stoicism. If what you're asking me is about grave and seriously introspective people. That's a little tougher one. I might say Pascal. Uh, I might say, if you're looking for a good emperor, a man who deals with the dangers and the weight of rule, I would look to India, to the history of Ashoka, who's quite an amazing individual. He's the great paradigm in Indian history of the good ruler and the man who forsakes evil in favor of good.
Okay. I have from one of our audience members, Marcus Aurelius had at least 5 children, as they recall. Was he stoical about them? Were they diplomatic or political assets, pieces of an imperial chessboard, or was he attached to any of them in a non-stoic way? Loving one's children seems to be more of a modern criterion for goodness.
Yeah. If you can imagine how nightmarish it might be to have Marcus Aurelius as your father. I mean, there are fathers who are demanding, and then there's this. So this is going to be a very difficult time for a child. On the other hand, unless I'm mistaken, most of his children, with the exception of 1 or 2 perhaps, died very young in childhood. So what he had to do, and one of the reasons why in the ancient and even medieval world, while people were slower to make those deep attachments, in other words, you didn't come and sit on daddy's lap when you were, 3 back then, is because you could expect a very high rate of infant mortality. So we have the luxury of bonding immediately and closely with our children, but we have 2% rather than 25% infant mortality, or 1%. So the point is, Marcus would have been a very hard father. I don't approve of Commodus. He's a menace. He's a disaster. But on the other hand, clearly the old man didn't know that the boy would be a disaster. And of course, Aurelius is so focused on the government that I think he had little time to be a father. So I don't see much room or much evidence for emotional connection, either with his children or anybody else.
Okay. And speaking of the leader of his family, let's go to being the leader of the Roman Empire. Is there anyone in more recent history, perhaps a leader or someone else, who has exhibited the same qualities of Marcus Aurelius?
Very, very hard to imagine. Someone that brings politics and ethics together. Very hard to imagine, at least for me, someone that's in the same league. The great conquerors cause mayhem and bloodshed and misery. The great rulers, well, they also tend to have great defects. So if you think about someone like, I don't know, Frederick the Great of Prussia, I mean, he's very important for raising Prussia as a power in Europe, but he militarizes the society thoroughly, and I'm not sure that the rest of Europe is better off for that. Maybe in some ways George Washington, because he was such a selfless leader. It takes a very unusual man to turn down the offer of a kingship, a monarchy. And I think that has happened very, very rarely in history. You have to have a very great and serious gravitas combined with self-control that would give a man enough strength to say no to a crown. So when he says, no, I think our people are suited to a republic. Yeah, I would say that's an example of genuine political wisdom.
Wonderful. And then this also came in, is Stoicism more Platonic than Aristotelian?
Aristotelian, yes, you're
Aristotelian, right. Excuse me, I apologize. Reading it too fast.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's probably more Platonic as I see it. But then again, everything is more Platonic than Aristotelian, as I see it. It just has to do with the fact that some people are born Platonists and some people are born Aristotelians. Let me try this. I can see how an Aristotelian might like Aurelius because he's interested in practical engagement with the demands of the world, something that Plato often is not. I mean, one of the justifiable objections to Plato is that you need ankle weights to keep him on the ground. Right. We ask him, what about the tables and chairs and houses and people in the world? And he says, well, we'll talk about them after we talk about ultimate reality. And Aristotle says, well, why don't we get some stuff done while we're thinking about ultimate reality? And Marcus Aurelius says many times, there's much studying that he could do, and he wishes that he were more learned than he is, but he just doesn't have time for that because he has an empire to run. And it's not about what makes him comfortable or that he finds pleasant. He has a job to do. He does his duty every day. I mean, the guy's really grim.
Speaking of that, on the grim side, after listening to the lecture, and I had the luxury of getting to listen to it a couple of times, I wanted to ask you, I know you touched on this in a couple of spots in your lecture, but you did use in order to be happy, one must be reasonable. But so few Roman emperors, as we all know from, reading and history, as well as just the like in books and literature and portrayal and fiction, they were the farthest thing from reasonable. You said yourself that Aurelius is one of only two rulers, essentially, or two leaders that did not crumble in some way under that absolute power. And that his stoic thought process would become outdated at a later date. Now, we didn't go into that, and that's fine. But as a contemporary in Aurelius's time, wouldn't he see the life of high libido, debauchery, and greed was considered a happy life from those who were living it at the moment? And therefore, what were his motives in viewing this lifestyle as an unhappy one and his lifestyle as a happy one?
Okay. That's a very complicated question.
It is. I apologize. There's
great question.
Thoughts going on in my head.
No, it's great. Let's start with sanity and rationality. There's a contemporary philosopher named Jürgen Habermas, and he says in order to have real political debate and real political community, we need to move as close as we can to what he calls the ideal speech situation. What that means is a situation where everybody gets to speak their mind without any constraints external, like being ill-treated or otherwise harmed for saying what you think. Okay, that makes a certain amount of sense. Now, the problem is that once you become a Roman emperor, all right, you are no longer possibly a member of the ideal speech situation. Everybody around you is modifying their actions and their speech because of the invisible gravitational field that comes with political power. If you have absolute power, people are watching you and they are modifying the way they talk. A great example comes, if any of you know Robert Graves' I, Claudius. Claudius is a comic figure. He's lame and stupid at court. But of course, being lame and stupid means that no one finds him threatening, so no one poisons him or anything. And Caligula, at the height of his madness, came up to Claudius and said to Claudius, someone else, XYZ, says that to ABC that he thinks I'm mad. And ABC agreed. And Caligula said to Claudius, do you think I'm mad, Claudius? And Claudius sat there for just a split second and said, well, the thought never occurred to me. Right? Now, you have to remember that no matter how crazy you are as a Roman emperor, the people around you are sucking up to you so fiercely that they're telling you that this is the height of sanity. Now, how can you tell once everybody around you is lying to you about stuff like that? People were so afraid of Caligula that when he said, well, I'm going to make my horse consul, everybody said, well, of course, naturally you're going to do that because you could end up dead that day, that hour. So that's the problem that the absolute ruler has to navigate. All right. So why did so many of them act crazy? Because they were being told by everybody around them that they were enormously sane and that every impulse they had was wonderful and good. That's the thing.
Very interesting. So we just have a couple more questions for you. I am saving one to the end. It is actually our highest rated, but I think it will be a good closer. So I'm not ignoring it for those of you who can see the Q&A panel. So I just have, first off, a lot of people are just saying thank you, and they wish that you were their professor in their college days, and they've really enjoyed it. And ultimately, we have that it seems that the time of Marcus Aurelius, there were other people who were trying to reach beyond the brutality of that brutal period, including Jesus. What was the water back then? What was in the water back then? Was there I'm guessing was there a political change happening? Was there an idea happening?
Well, it's that's a big question. Since you're librarians, you might want to go to Robert Bella's work. He wrote one giant book on the history of religion, which I highly recommend. But the argument that he makes, and I think it's correct, is that between roughly the year 1000 BC and 0, the time of Jesus, all over the world, the great world religions develop, and they don't develop in isolated communities like Polynesia. They develop in enormous population centers. So you get them in China, you get them in India, you get them in Persia, Mesopotamia, Egypt. You also get them in Mesoamerica. All right. So these are big religions. There's a reason. Well, the Mesoamericans, it's hard to know exactly the timing for them because we know relatively little about them. So let me bracket them for now. But let's look at the old world ones. If you look at the second millennium BC, from 2000 to 1000 in Mesopotamia, you'll note that there's a spike and fall, boom and bust, rise and crash. That goes on for a century or two and then crashes and goes on for a century or two. The reason why is because Mesopotamia falls to political and military disorder. Now, here's the deal. What they didn't have in 1500 BC, they had, or they were developing between the year 1000 and the year 0. And what they were lacking is justice. In other words, all the great world religions are thematizing the same thing, justice. What that means is that human beings are animals that domesticate themselves. Rulers and conquerors treated humans like livestock. They domesticated the underclass. The problem is they made themselves hated by their abuse and ill treatment of the people they ruled. They treated them with no reciprocity. Since that's the case, whenever they got invaded from the outside or whenever there was an internal civil war among the elite, the people, the farmers who hated the rulers, helped the invaders put their heads on sticks. Then the society collapses. And they do that 2, 3, 4 times in between 2000 and 1000. Now, what is it that their society lacks? It's not people and it's not civilization. What they lack is a way of getting the vast majority of society to buy in to a society that's guided around the idea of reciprocity and mutuality. And that's why Confucius demands justice, and that's why the Hebrew prophets demand justice, and why Buddha demands justice, and why Jesus demands justice, and why Zoroaster demands justice, and why they're all doing it at the same time. So the great world religions are not like fins on a Cadillac. They're functional. And the function they serve is they allow us to finish the process of domestication. It's what elites use to domesticate themselves. What protects powerful people from their own power is justice. And when they do that, the people around them don't hate them and the societies don't collapse. And that's why you get the big world civilizations once they're able to add in this new idea, justice. Platonism, I include among the great world religions.
Okay. Yeah, it does. And it's just interesting. I won't go into it because we are starting to run a little bit short on time, but just looking at today's context, I know we have some attendees from the UK and other parts of the globe, but definitely the vast majority of them are from the US. And looking at today's context, there's a lot to be said for Aurelius's view on Stoicism and power and just how to live the better life. So I have two final comments that I've been saving just because I figured they would be good to save to the end. Is we did have a question on, do you do more talks or discussions, and what to read in Marcus Aurelius for ourselves to get what you spoke of? So are there any additional features or additional books that would help talk about, either Stoics or Aurelius himself? And just for those who did not see Kelly's comment in the comments, we did share the professor's YouTube video, which has a longer, more in-depth lecture on meditations itself as well. And we'll be sharing those after the webinar as well.
All right. Aurelius' Meditations is not a hard read. It's little notes to himself.
Mm-hmm.
Rarely does it go a full page. It doesn't really have much in the way of structure. I mean, Aurelius, when he died, or before he died, ordered that his papers be burned. His subordinates, after his death, looked at this and said, "We don't dare burn this. I mean, this is just too good. This is just that would be a crime." So he didn't intend to publish this book at all. So it doesn't really have a structure. These are little notes to himself. Imagine this put on Post-it notes all over the guy's desk saying, "Maintain your temper." Of course, they're lying to you. Chill, right? That's the best they can do. Aurelius, I would be inclined to say, doesn't need to be read. It's only about 100 pages or so. It's not a big book, and you can pick it up anywhere. In that respect, it's sort of like Montaigne's essays.
Okay.
Okay, what else?
And then the final one that we should end on is, do you have a favorite quote from Meditations or two, and why are they your favorites?
Yeah, all right. There is a favorite quote. I'm not sure that I'll be able to quote it exactly because I have a brain like a colander now. But if I remember it, it says, "You who are destined to end so soon are weary of the evil men in the world, and yet the gods love them and take care of them in all ways. Are you sure that you are weary of the bad men in the world, and this too when you are one of them?" And that's just Marcus Aurelius saying, look, no matter how much messed up stuff, and look, this is something we should keep in mind between now and election day, no matter how much messed up stuff happens, we should keep a cool head and not do anything rash or that would be excessive, because we're going to have to live with these people on both sides the day after the election day. So, a little public spiritedness, a little restraint, self-control might help us in these difficult times.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor. I really, truly appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you.
For those of you who haven't been on our website, we do have some more recent webinars upcoming. I have definitely loved getting this deeper dive into Marcus Aurelius, and we have two more coming up with the professor, Dr. Sugrue, in our Classics Revisited series. He will be discussing Moliere's famous comedy, The Misanthrope, next week on the 15th of October, next Thursday, and then the history of the Peloponnesian War on the 22nd. We've also had a number of great conversations with library leaders across the world as well, and even with more coming up in October. All of our webinars are available on demand after the fact, and we also have a number on our website that you can register for and get into your calendars. Check back regularly to that bibliotheca.com/events for those webinars. And finally, as we finish today, we would love for everybody to complete a quick survey to see how you enjoyed our work break with the classics. If you have any questions, leave them in the follow-up survey that will pop up as you log off. We would just love to hear back from you and the content that we're putting out. And with that, from everyone at Bibliotheca, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you again to Dr. Sugrue for leading today's discussion.